Welcome back. In this lecture, I'd like to focus a little bit more on society and culture, and especially this notion of statism. I mentioned before that the left and the right have traditionally agreed on statism. This is what makes Macron really uh, a transformative character in French politics, because he, more than any other president in the history of the Fifth Republic, talks about the market. Now, he understands French culture and society, and he isn't pushing this too much. But go back to your notes under 1B, where it says statism is the idea that a strong government should run things, especially major industry. De Gaulle believed that that was true because he believed that the best and brightest should guide the commanding heights of the economy to provide social order and especially national security. For people on the left, people like Mitterrand, who was the leader of the Socialist Party, he believed in statism because he believed that the government could then guarantee jobs, wages, good working conditions, and could foster greater equality. So interestingly, even though conservatives have had a primacy on order and liberals on equality, both of them believed that statism was the vehicle that could do that. I would ask you to think about those numbers from Roskin from your textbook, where people are asked, should capitalism be kept and does it work well? 65% of people in China, 55% of Americans, 45% of Brits, and 45% of Germans, but only 15% of French people said yes. The French see business as callous, as exploitative, as inhumane, and as a result, whether the politician is conservative or liberal, very, very few of them of either political persuasion are openly pro-business. The French have a very significant and generous welfare state, far more generous than the American welfare state. And so then the question about whether statism is a good thing or a bad thing becomes quite a debate. Obviously, in the United States, statism is usually a term that is used very derisively. For example, if you listen to conservative talk show, they will often say, well, the Democrats in America are a bunch of statists, which is not true. I don't hear Democrats out there calling for the nationalization of industry or running industry on any large scale. I would say that American Democrats are welfarists, not statists. But I think that if you want to make the argument for or against statism, just using France as your case study, if you want to be a critic of statism and see a complete boondoggle in a place where statism completely fell apart, that case study would be the Concord. The Concord was a supersonic transit plane. There were very few of them made. I think only 11 of them ended up being produced. They were very inefficient. They were gas hogs, and really an example of statism gone bad. The Airbus in Europe, the 747 in America were far better aircraft and were mass produced, and the Concorde kind of became one of those embarrassments of history, kind of the Edsel of aircraft. On the other hand, if you want to make a case study for statism, certainly I think a very good case study of this would be the case study that is in your book, that being French electricity being generated by nuclear energy. Now, in the United States, nuclear energy is seen as something that did not work very well. Nuclear plants in America have a very, very checkered past. I know in the Sacramento area where I lived for 18 years, we had a nuclear reactor called Rancho Seco, and its nickname was Rancho Mistako, because when it worked, it was incredible. It produced nuclear energy that was very, very cheap. And I remember my electric bills under SMUD, the Sacramento Metropolitan Utility District, very, very cheap. But when it would go offline, then those costs would go up dramatically. Uh, the creation of a very strong nuclear program was a conservative endeavor. In this particular case, the primary motivation came about French policymakers, and this goes all the way back to de Gaulle, although de Gaulle really was not the architect of French nuclear energy so much. But going all the way back to de Gaulle, one of the key policies that they wanted to achieve in France was energy security and energy independence. There was a tremendous oil shock in 1973 that massively increased the price of energy, electricity, and fuel. And as a reaction to that 1973 oil shock, the French in 1974 decided to standardize their French nuclear reactors. In this case, unlike the United States, where nuclear reactors had various designs, there was no coordination between them. The French decided very early in the 1970s that we are going to take this American design. Ironically, French nuclear reactors are a Westinghouse, an American design. The design works very well. The plants all operate the same. People can operate on a nuclear reactor in northern France or southern France, and they all operate the same. And the result of this French central planning or statism is that 75% of French electricity is generated by nuclear power plants, which is by far it is by far the most energy independent. They use nuclear energy to far greater degree than any other state in Europe. De Gaulle had initiated this as early as 1960 to look into this to try to make the country more energy independent. But because oil prices were cheap, they didn't get very far. But then when that energy crisis hit, the French government took a very ambitious step, 57 nuclear reactors. And in this particular case, the result of that is that today the French are the largest net exporter of electricity in the world. Your book doesn't mention this. I don't have it in the notes. But if you're wondering how profitable the exporting of electricity is to countries like Spain, in Italy, in Britain, in Germany, the French government is generating over 3 billion euros a year in income by exporting electricity. Now, there are people, and certainly this was a push of Hollande, and now Macron is kind of talking both sides of this issue, so I'm not sure where this is going to go. But I know when Hollande became president, the socialists made it a push to emphasize renewable energy sources, solar, wind, hydroelectric, with a goal of reducing the dependence on nuclear energy from 75% of their electricity production to 50% by 2035. There are some more conservative voices that are saying that this is a moneymaker, that nuclear energy produces by far the cheapest energy out there, and that if we can produce cheap solar, wind, hydroelectric, that's great. But if not, let's kind of cool down the rate by which we kind of wean ourselves away from nuclear energy. So people who are going to tell you that centralized planning can be a good thing in France, they'll usually talk about their electricity program. They are by far the largest exporter of electricity in the world. And a lot of people say that if you want to look at their educational system, their K to 12 education, statism, the centralization of education has been very, very successful in their particular case as well. Now, I have something that I just put in the notes that really isn't particularly related to this lecture so much, but I do want to just say a few words about, because your book talks about Hollande, and even though he's no longer the president, Hollande in many ways looks like Mitterrand in the sense that the rhetoric certainly was more to the left than he actually governed. Like Mitterrand, Hollande was much more willing to use military force than his conservative counterparts. This isn't in your book, but I just added it. For example, Hollande, when he was president, used military forces to combat Islamic terrorists. He even, when there was a terrorist attack in Paris, he actually used that emergency power, remember, for about a dozen days. In many ways, Hollande, during a time of crisis, behaved much like a conservative president, Mr. de Gaulle, had acted during the Algerian crisis. One more thing to conclude this section kind of on culture a little bit. There's a nice discussion about racism in France. I talked earlier about the racism towards Jews before World War II, the Dreyfus crisis, and how Vichy France collaborated with the Nazis and sent lots of Jews to their deaths in the death camps. The current racial controversy involves Muslims. In France, there are more Muslims than in either Britain or Germany. And you may remember when I talked about Britain, I said one of the things that distinguishes the United States in Muslims vis-a-vis European countries and Muslims is that in the United States there are a lot of cross-cutting cleavages to integrate Muslims. So Muslims are more integrated than Americans as a whole. They have more education. They have assimilated quite well into communities. In Europe, and especially in France, Muslims are very ghettoized. They don't have as much education as the French do as a whole. They are put into ghettos. They don't have very good jobs. And the result is that Muslims have kind of become the poster child for French right-wing nationalism. In France, as I mentioned earlier, it is a very Catholic country. 90% of French babies are baptized Catholic, even though only 13% attend Mass regularly. There are some scholars who believe that France is going to have a resurgence of Catholicism to combat Islam. That isn't a position that Roskin takes. It certainly isn't something that I necessarily believe. I believe that the French will probably emphasize a secular response, and your textbook talks about the headscarf controversy. But what I do believe is that the Muslims are going to continue to be the case study, the poster child for resentment, for right-wing nationalism, and that you're going to see political parties, especially the National Front, who are going to continue to scapegoat Muslims, who are going to blame Muslims for the economic malaise of France. And as I mentioned in the last election, who were the people who were most likely to support the National Front? It was the people who were the least educated. It was the people with the least incomes. It was people who were unemployed, who didn't really have hope. And instead of saying that there might be a problem with the political or economic system and maybe we need political or economic reform, the easy thing to do is to scapegoat another group of people, the Muslims, who in many ways suffer the same economic distress they do, and yet blame them instead of the system. When I come back,